Hi, my name is Monis Khan, and this is Colored Commentary, our interactive platform bringing together the world's most radical minds to discuss today's most controversial topics, all the while encouraging you, our audience, to participate in our conversation using Twitter and Facebook. Our guest today is no stranger to controversy. His name is Keane Bhatt, and he's a writer and activist based in Washington, D.C. By day, he works in community development, but by night, he is a professional pain in the ass to all those promoting profits over people in our nation's news media. Now, Keane has extensive experience on television. He's joined Al Jazeera English as a Stream, as well as Democracy Now!, but he always seems to maintain his composure. Let's see if we can get him to slip up and say some shit he's going to regret. Keane, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Monis. Pleasure to be with you.
Keane, I got to ask you, man, I have no idea how you do it. You are always contemplating the world's injustices, and yet you are able to maintain such a sunny disposition. You always got a smile on your face. I'm going to be honest with you, Keane. Activism kind of seems like it sucks. The coolest perks about being an activist is like the time when, you got beat up by the police and thrown in jail, or maybe you're lucky enough to get tear gassed and become a viral social media sensation. But aside from a gnarly tricep workout while you're picketing, I sometimes wonder, where are the perks? Keane, I know you have extensive experience in activism. Share with us some of the change that you felt was really cool that you got to experience through your work.
Well, I think that the payoffs are over a very long-term period. So it may seem as if it's, really a downer and that you're getting hurt and so on. But I think that if you look at the broad trends in U.S. history, the way that people of color have become empowered, the way that women have also, become empowered, the way that we've really created a collective consciousness around the environment and so on. These are the really extraordinarily important shifts in people's way of thinking, and that's kind of how you have to think about the gains and the kinds of benefits of doing this kind of work. But I think that one of the interesting things that I do is it's kind of virtual activism, and I think that there are really exciting ways to really engage and interact with the dominant voices in our society through these new opportunities that have emerged through social media and the internet and so on. So one of the things that we've been really engaged on is demanding accuracy out of our mainstream media, and not simply the easy targets like the Fox News outlets and others, but really the preeminent intellectual journals in our society, like the New Yorker magazine or the New York Times, the paper of record. And I focus a lot on U.S. military around the world and the way that the logic of this military empire ends up corrupting even the most elementary kinds of fact-checking and just the most basic empirical kinds of documentation. And what we've been able to do on a repeated basis is show how powerful that ideology is in corrupting and creating massive amounts of disinformation for the U.S. public. And we've forced these very institutions like the New York Times and the New Yorker to issue really embarrassing corrections. So, for example, the New Yorker was forced in its print magazine to explain to its readers that Hugo Chavez was not, as it was reported, brought into power through a coup d'etat, but in fact he was democratically elected in 1998, and came into power in 1999 through elections. In the New York Times magazine, they had to issue a very embarrassing correction explaining how there is not a complete dominance of the state oppressing private media, and in fact there's many opposition critics that are routinely provided a voice within the most powerful and most widely watched television stations. And so these end up kind of cutting against the dominant narrative, and I think that it's important because what activists have learned is that it's very difficult to oppose a war once the machinery of the state and once the machinery of the media, which is oftentimes an adjunct to these state prerogatives, end up getting into high gear. And once the inertia is there, it's very difficult to stop a war. So with the Iraq War, we had millions of people all over the world protesting against it. But because this had been such an ongoing long-term priority for the U.S. government, it was just too little too late. And I think what activists have learned over that really tragic history is that if we are very vigilant now, we can prevent the next war from taking place. And that's what we're trying to do in the cases of Venezuela, which is, target number one for regime change and overthrow by the U.S. government in the hemisphere, and also in the case of Iran, which is also the subject of ongoing acts of destabilization.
Keane, I got to ask you, it seems like even though your activism is so effective that it causes you to use various capacities of your intelligence and your skill sets, that it might actually be a professional liability. And I'm wondering, Keane, just your activism alone, has it already precluded you from working for the Fortune 500 companies? And I'm just wondering, does this ever bleed into your thought like, oh my God, I got to be careful what I say because if I want gainful employment, this might come back to haunt me?
Well, I'm actually very thankful that this kind of work has forever precluded me from ever joining the Fortune 500, and I have no intentions whatsoever for kind of apologizing for my past or to in some way renounce my leftist credentials, which is oftentimes a stepping stone for people like Christopher Hitchens and others who were part of the left and who wish to then seek kind of mainstream credibility and the kinds of perquisites of power that you get to benefit from as a result of that. And so I think that, yes, taking a principled stance against militarism, against imperialism, and against, these kinds of forces that end up having such a ruinous impact throughout the planet, and really pushing back against the kind of corrupt political establishment which ends up abetting these kinds of tendencies of ongoing militarism and domination. There are no real, material benefits to that. You get a very rich experience, and you get to collaborate with very interesting and passionate people who are also striving for these similar objectives. So in that sense, there's an enormous amount of benefits that one gets from participating actively in these kinds of struggles. But I think that we shouldn't focus too much on the kinds of opportunities that are precluded from this kind of work, especially because what we're trying to do is work on behalf of people who are dealing with the actual brunt and the actual real physical consequences of the of U.S. militarism. So, for example, going out into the street or protesting or appearing on television won't make me the subject of some kind of an extrajudicial, assassination by a death squad somewhere. And that's routinely what takes place in Honduras, for example, where people are pushing back against a U.S.-backed, extremely corrupt, extremely violent and repressive state after the U.S. Ended up supporting a military dictatorship that overthrew the democratically elected president of that country, Manuel Zelaya. Or, for example, when thousands of people were out in Washington, D.C. in full force against the Israeli and U.S.-backed crimes against humanity and war crimes, the bombings of homes, playgrounds, UN facilities, and so on. We won't have to deal with Hellfire missiles attacking us while we sleep, or the threat of what to do about our next meal and the safety of our children living in an open-air prison in Gaza. So when you put it in context, the kinds of sacrifices that we make are so trivial and so almost frivolous to talk about that I think that so many of us can engage in a much more active level than we are, and I think that it's a challenge for us and an opportunity for us to put it into that perspective in order to use the privileges and the opportunities that we're given living in the society, and people like myself who are relatively privileged, to really take that challenge head on and to try to make the most of the resources that we've been given.
So, Keane, one thing that you've been active on a lot lately is you have been a major pain in the ass to the executive director of Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth. Now, Keane, why the beef with Human Rights Watch? Don't they do great work?
They have done really important, very critical work, and they have many researchers on the ground who've documented human rights abuses, and they should be commended for that. However, Human Rights Watch is very much like the New York Times in that it sets the acceptable narrative, and it frames many issues, and it basically delimits the normal conversation that is permissible within our society. And because of its influence, because it is endowed with a $100 million donation from investor George Soros, because it has such a powerful network to the media, and it has such a very prominent platform internationally and domestically, Human Rights Watch should not be absolved from scrutiny. In fact, it should be even greater a target for accountability. And one of the things that I've documented very closely, and which has been indisputed up until now, is the way in which Human Rights Watch has a very unhealthy relationship with the U.S. government. The way that it's based in New York, the way that Ken Roth attends state dinners, for Barack Obama, the way that it has a revolving door by which, high-level U.S. officials who are actively employed by human rights abusing entities within the U.S. government then go on to work for Human Rights Watch as supposed advocates and people who are opposing the kinds of human rights abuses that are being committed by the very employers that they once worked for, and then they furthermore go back into these same branches of the U.S. government, which are actively again involved in abuses and atrocities and so on. So that kind of very pernicious and insidious relationship with state power would not be permitted were it a country like Venezuela or Ecuador or Iran. I think that if, for example, Human Rights Watch were based in Santiago, Chile in the 1970s, where that government under Pinochet was maintaining an international extrajudicial drone campaign in which the head of state had the secret and absolute power to kill a Chilean or any global citizen anywhere on the planet under secret orders to be determined every week, which is what President Obama does on what he calls Terror Tuesdays, where the administration basically mulls over who to assassinate. I think that human rights organization based in Chile would be completely laughed at if it were to start documenting abuses in Europe, let's say. So I think that we need to be holding these supposedly independent organizations to a much higher standard. And if they insist on calling themselves independent organizations, independent international organizations, then they have to sever their ties that create these very pernicious, perverse incentives whereby their employees and their advocates end up, toning down their criticisms of the U.S. government in relation to other crimes around the world.
So I just want to push back on you, Keane. One of your suggestions as a response to the revolving door, one way that you suggest that Human Rights Watch can maintain its independence is by instituting a cooling off period of what you suggested 5 years before a person can go from Human Rights Watch to a high office in the U.S. government. Now I'm just wondering, Keane, A, is that number arbitrary? And B, don't we want these thoughtful people in these offices?
Well, I think you're right. I'm guilty as charged. It is a fairly arbitrary number. I decided on 5 years because it is a substantial amount of time, and because that is longer than a typical presidential election cycle. So those were the considerations that I came into, basically constructing that possible solution. But I think that really the fact is that the very fact that when Reed Brody, their official spokesperson and counsel, dismissed that position as a gimmick on Democracy Now! When I debated him, indicates to people that Human Rights Watch is not dealing with these criticisms in an upright and an honest way. I think that if there is clear documentation, and there is literally no way to refute this. You have people who have once worked for the CIA, possibly the greatest human rights abuser in the Western Hemisphere over the past half century, and not to mention its extremely sordid role in the Middle East and elsewhere. People who worked for the CIA then go on to serve on advisory committees for Human Rights Watch to ostensibly advise on human rights conditions in the Americas before then going back into the State Department, this time with the official task of serving as an interlocutor between the U.S. intelligence community and non-government experts. If that's not a conflict of interest, I don't know what is. And so when you have this kind of a relationship developing, whereby high-level functionaries who are complicit in U.S. crimes then go on to work within Human Rights Watch. Tom Malinowski is another case in which he was the head lobbyist for Human Rights Watch, and before that was the senior director for the National Security Council for the White House under Bill Clinton, when Clinton illegally bombed Yugoslavia, violating the UN Charter and committing the supreme international crime under the Nuremberg tribunals. When this kind of a person who has internalized the value system of the State Department, of the White House, of the kind of exceptionalism that pervades our entire establishment culture, where we think that the entire world is a legitimate global battlefield and that the United States can serve as the benign hegemon for the planet in maintaining security and so on. These kinds of value systems end up deeply corrupting independent organizations. And Human Rights Watch, the very fact that it has not gone after NATO and has not demanded that NATO leaders be sent to the International Criminal Court for war crimes tells you something, because a war criminal, this former Secretary General Javier Solana of NATO, is currently a member of the board of directors for Human Rights Watch. How can Human Rights Watch explain the very presence of a war criminal, somebody who initiated a war against the UN Charter, who presided over the use of cluster munitions, which bombed civilian targets, and the deliberate missile strikes of a television station, killing 16 people? This is a war criminal, and he should be brought to justice. He should not be serving on the most preeminent, human rights organization in the world, and he should not be lauded and be celebrated and have a cushy position at the Brookings Institution as a senior scholar on foreign policy. What this tells you is a deep level of racism within the human rights discourse. If an African, military leader were serving on Human Rights Watch, there would be instant scrutiny. And the fact that these are Western European people who ended up serving as adjuncts to U.S. war crimes tells you that these people have complete impunity to rule and to dominate the planet. And I think that this is a very important kind of a criticism that I'm trying to make, along with 2 Nobel Peace Prize laureates and 2 former UN officials, including Richard Falk, the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestinian human rights. So it's not just me. This is a very broad coalition of people who are demanding that Human Rights Watch live up to its stated claim of independence and to renounce and to sever its ties to human rights abusers within its midst.
And Keane, I want to pivot now to something that is kind of catching all of the nation's attention. You can't go on Twitter or Facebook without seeing news coming out of Ferguson, Missouri, following the tragic death of Mike Brown. It's basically enraptured our collective imagination here in America. And a lot of the topics of conversation, are about the looting, they're about the death itself, but also about the militarization of a local police force in Ferguson, Missouri. I'm just wondering, to you, is this an anomaly, what we're seeing, or is this part of a greater trend?
Well, this is part of a greater trend. This could be traced back to the 1960s if you wanted, or the 1970s, but the militarization of our local police forces has been in effect for a long time. For example, the assassination of Fred Hampton, a teenager but a very important leader within the Black Power movement, that was facilitated by the FBI in conjunction with local police forces in Chicago to murder him in his sleep. And so this is kind of going back to what I was talking about, where people of a certain level of privilege within the United States do not have to deal with the ultimate kinds of sacrifices made by, people of color, people in low incomes, people who have for many years in U.S. history been the targets of massive amounts of oppression and state violence. And it gives us an opportunity to build on these struggles to fight for a better world. But going back to the militarization of the police, I think that it illustrates the fundamental contradiction that we have in our society, which is that we claim to be a democracy, we claim to be a republic, but at the same time, the liberal establishment is absolutely at home with the domination of the rest of the world and the maintenance of a U.S. Military imperial project. And I think that it comes back to that core issue, with the long time kind of conundrum, which is that you can have a republic or you can have an empire, but you can't have both. And the way that the most sociopathic elements of a military empire end up bleeding into our domestic life, the way that the military-industrial complex puts a veto on the public will for greater investment at home for social uplift, what Martin Luther King routinely decried as the madness of militarism. This is seeping into places as far strewn as Ferguson, Missouri, suburb of St. Louis, and the way that these communities have become increasingly war zones. And I think that what's important as well is that the liberal establishment and people like Washington Post reporters, who are now beginning to have a taste of what it means to be manhandled and brutalized by local police forces who are decked in riot gear and commando uniforms with assault weapons and anti-ballistic tanks, etc. When they're beginning to actually feel it, I think that this is an important moment right now for activists to use the kind of broad kind of outrage over the status quo for very concrete measures. The way that Eric Garner was put in a chokehold and killed on camera, and then the person who filmed that is being completely persecuted by the New York Police Department. We can be demanding that these people who have been given lethal force and have used it with impunity and have concocted story after story which never comports with eyewitness testimony, these people have the use of lethal force. It's only fair that they be accountable minute by minute with cameras on their person so that we can see the outcomes of their behaviors. When we're endowing them with the ability to kill anyone with lethal weapons, they must be held accountable. They must be transparent. So, ACLU has been demanding that cameras be put on police forces. Even political elites like Eric Holder have been speaking out finally about needing to reorient and revisit the policy by which the U.S. military is handing out all of this advanced weaponry to create a sense of impunity and control, and the way that these local police end up lording themselves over their communities rather than being subject to the will of these communities. So we need to be shifting the power dynamic. We need to be demanding that local city council officials really fight back against the militarization, to refuse the way that all of this extremely sophisticated military technology is being unquestioningly adopted by these local police officials for no credible reason whatsoever, other than retaining greater power over communities, especially communities of color. So there are a number of really important steps at this critical juncture that we can use this momentum and this outrage over to be pushing for a more just and less brutal society.
Keane, I know, not only do you read and you write about these types of things, about what's happening in Ferguson, what's happening in Israel and Gaza, what's happening in, with the surveillance state here in America, with the militarization of our local police forces. Not only are you reading and writing, but you're also in the streets. I know you were at the moment of silence for Mike Brown a few days ago. You were also at the protest a few weeks ago in D.C. about what's happening in Gaza. And I'm not going to lie, Keane, you're always dressed to impress. And I know I'm not the only one. There are a lot of activists out there that are going to these protests not because they're passionate about these topics only, but also because they're looking for romance. Now, I just want to ask you, man, do you have any fashion tips, any suggestions for those people looking for love at the next sit-in or the next boycott?
I think that you need to find. I actually don't have any good advice for people. Wear good clothes, I guess. I don't really consider myself a very fashionable person personally, but I'm kind of at a loss in terms of personal suggestions. Find somebody who is not constantly, macking it, and somebody who doesn't seem like they've got a lot of different people in their stable, and somebody who doesn't seem too sketchy. And I think that...
So stay away from me. That's what you're saying. You're saying stay away from Big Mo. I'm not mad at you, Keane. Keane, I know I could shoot the shit with you all day, but that's all the time we have for today's episode. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. I'd like to thank Keane Bhatt for everyone here at Colored Commentary. Middle fingers to the police state. God bless America, and can't wait to see you next time. Oh, Keane, we did it.